Hello and a very warm welcome to our event on declining competition, a transatlantic challenge. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm happy to with David Wessel, who is the director of the Hutchinson. We are extremely pleased and honored to Kristalina Georgieva is the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Amy Klobuchar is the senator, US Senator. Vestager is the executive vice president of the European Commission competition policy. And we want to discuss. So if you in the audience want to add your question, market power, and then you can ask your questions, which David and I will take in the second half of our conversation. Turn to our first panelist, Managing Director Georgieva. Kristalina, thank you so much. Ask you first about why is the International Monetary Fund power, and what does it have to do really with the classical mandate of the IMF, which is, I thought, is more about monetary.
The importance of the topic cannot be overstated. At the time when we want to pull out from the pandemic, is rising market power denting this dynamism? And the IMF is, yes, left it to less incentives for firms to pay, and it could even damage the income of companies they work for. Topic today, on one hand, that the pandemic can push this power further up. Why? Because we are projecting as a withdrawal of support for companies, more bankruptcy, more concentration. We are positive because governments are paying. Be demonstrated any better level playing field, dynamic competition from the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager. So we are in a situation in which have instruments in their hands they can apply, so we can have more investment as a result. Let me go straight to what is new in the research we are putting out today. Are becoming entrenched, and more evidence than when this is happening are kind of pushed back in terms in the economy. More specifically, the competitor sales are going down, the growth rate of sales. Even more importantly, R&D of competitors is going down in our research by 4%. At the time we need more dynamism in the economy, we may have less act. And I'm very eager to hear how on the two sides of the Atlantic competitive economy is evolving.
I understand we may be having some audio problems, and I wonder if the people at Bruegel could check this out. Let's continue the conversation and hope they can fix it as soon as. And I want to compliment you on being able to your jacket. The senator is joining us today from the Mall of America outside Minneapolis. We're really pleased to have you. So, Senator, firms, particularly in tech, as a high priority issue. What is the economic harm you're trying to address here? Uber profitable firms that are profitable because they're smart, firms that are uber profitable because they're squelching competition.
For that question, David. And yes, I think it's kind of fitting I'm at the mall, which of course been hard hit during the pandemic, but I'm actually here because it's a big vaccine site, and the governor and I and a few people to get vaccines, and also talk about the state of our economy. And you can't without acknowledging what's been going on with that economy and the closure as all these so many small businesses in America, hundreds of thousands of exacerbated what was already an enormous problem in our country of concentration. Always have been one. I worked in the private sector for 15 years, represented companies, by the way, was suing big monopolies to try to get into the market. That we need to unleash the power of capitalism and innovation to make this work. And right now what's happened, when you ask what's the difference, stifling competition, well, that's been there for us to know for a long time. And that's monopoly and interpreted by the court. You can have highly successful at some point, and this is why Adam Smith, the godfather of American capitalism, in his Wealth of Nations, army of monopolies, and that at some point a company gets so big that it starts squelching innovation. And I think that Zuckerberg's email when he was corresponding about the was that it is better to buy than compete. And he also, businesses are nascent, but the networks established, the brands are already meaningful. The whole idea of capitalism, and especially tech, is disruption, of getting new players in the market. And that have this huge privacy problem or misrepresentation and misinformation on the internet if we market. Instead, what happened with Facebook and Google, so those bells and whistles were not allowed to develop. So yes, you often solve problems, and that is not happening right now in the tech area. So I have nothing against successful companies. I have a lot believe that if you want to keep rejuvenating capitalism, so you have the next Google and competition policy, and in the US, that means antitrust laws.
Margrethe, let's turn to you, Executive Vice President. So great to have you also for your tough competition enforcement, at least in Brussels, and that it needed to complement its competition toolbox with the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market. I think my reading is you feel that the classical competition tools are perhaps not enough. So can you perhaps, especially in the digital space?
Well, thank you for doing this. Thank you for giving us these new results. I think it's increasing concentration because it is. I think it's crucial when you look at sort of the individual or an antitrust case. What you don't see is, of course, the entire landscape. To us, with the study today, is basically the entire landscape. In Europe, in some sectors, in communication, in pharmaceuticals, in finance, vigilant competition law enforcement is needed. Also, because now, when we sort of where it becomes, really industrial, where everything, transportation, any kind of production, everything digitalizes. And as Amy said, it's great when and success is a new thing in a digital market. You have network effects, you have, a completely different dynamic. To say, with success comes power, with power comes responsibility, and it's so fast. And this is why we are proposing to complement sort of the case-by-case. The players get a fair chance in markets where gatekeepers are present. And there are things that they cannot do because it is so powerful in the marketplace that it has to be prohibited. It's really a matter of the heart that every business have a fair they're coming from, and competition will then equal opportunities, a more, and because of that, also a better social cohesion. In a situation like this, where we want to recover, while at the same time make best use of digital tools and fight climate change. So, I mentioned in the beginning is sort of a core tool, is a core asset that we cannot give.
Thank you.
I thought I would like to note that to quoting the Spider-Man movie from the US.
Well, Senator, as long as we have you, and I know you have your time is limited, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how much do we require new legislation?
Sure. Well, I think you need both. And what you're seeing is the sea change going on. A attorney general that just got confirmed in Merrick Garland, who is very familiar with antitrust. He's taught antitrust. He's handled a strong working knowledge of a very complex area of the law. I think that's good. While he, Tim Wu, who's known as in the president, that's been announced. There are a lot of reports out there that Lena Khan, who's very aggressive on tech, you already see some people being put in place that are going to be change makers, which I think is a good thing. Congress right now is to get the resources so those agencies can't just take these big cases on the biggest companies. Bipartisan bill with Senator Chuck Grassley, who's the highest ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee right now, antitrust by some changing of the filing fees. So that's the first thing, most important. And on things like there's also, it's not just antitrust, privacy. We have no major changes to any. That has to happen in the US. And then with antitrust, some new, but also the consolidation we're seeing all over. Our courts have become really conservative in terms of their rulings. At one point, the US Supreme Court, the latest editions of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, they've both been really conservative on antitrust. And Justice fixes, changes to the law so that our laws are sophisticated as the economy regulate. And so that's what I've suggested with my bill, is to make really all areas of industry. We've seen so much consolidation in America, from everything from catfish. And in fact, it was John Oliver, the comedian, who had a segment on his show. And at the very transportation and the like, at the very end, he said, if this is enough to make you want to die, good luck, because there's only, now there's just two, because one bought the other one.
Thank you.
You to dwell a bit more on on some of the findings of your report, and in particular, what's the effect of the pandemic. Small shops are closing, and the big online retailers are thriving. I mean, I wonder, what's the role of antitrust here? I mean, at the end of the reasons. Perhaps you can say a word on that. What's your conclusion on that? But also dwell a bit on this issue that was the mergers and acquisitions of the big tech firms. You're finding there, how much is that of an issue, and how do you see the policy?
Let me first say that as somebody who has in a non-market economy, I'm totally they deliver goods and consumers in a way that to substitute with anything else. And when we talk about they are only bad, because obviously they can deliver at investing more in innovation, celebrating the fact that vaccines have arrived very companies had the capacity to invest massively in solving a problem. So I'm saying this because I don't want the conversation and we absolutely have to cut companies to pieces. But to zero in on big is not a force for good. First, we have companies rather than to innovate and invest. And unfortunately, the evidence is that increased market power, that temptation of markups over the last 40 years. So to go to the issue of online retailers could be why bother to invest and innovate when you can just charge a little bit more and get the same or even better profit? What it means is that we have to pay much more attention to how get even bigger through mergers, to be even more vigilant firms reaching out to buy others upfront, and then make sure that there is plenty of fertile small firms to come in. The sad fact, small firms have shrunk their share in output by going beyond what is healthy for consumers and for the economy as a whole. We'll talk more about it, but in our research, what we see is that there has to be much more prevent the abuse of dominant position. You have it, use it for good. Of small companies, and that we have to be mindful of other second, because I'm very, very concerned about it, and it is the impact on labor. Over time, this dominant position of ups and profitability, okay, nothing wrong to be rewarded with profit, but when that depressed wages, then it is not, and we have to pay attention to it. Impact of concentration of market power on products, but also on inputs, and especially on is doable, can be done, in sort of the no-brainer category, to not allow companies to no poach of workers. Why? Poach mine, and that is happening in the tech sector. Unfortunately, basically telling workers is you have less power to negotiate. And why is this something we should care about? Coming out of the pandemic is an increase in damages the social fabric on which the vibrancy of our economies depend, of our. Stop here, but that is a point I'm so glad I could make.
Margarethe Versteger, One of the points that the IMF report, it's on the imf.org website now, is that we have to have global cooperation on these antitrust issues, cross-national borders. We don't want to have 130 different. Do you see any prospects, particularly transatlantic, between
very good point and observation that we're dealing with global companies. Sometimes they're addressing regional and also in their outreach, and we have a long-standing but of course we can be even better. We are sort of on the brink of launching because when you look at the pharmaceutical viable, it was important that the pipeline was also divested so that there would be a new competing product here. And for our democracies to set a framework of a dynamic development of these technologies and existing and emerging businesses. Democracies, old and or new, big, in order to make sure that citizens enjoy privacy, that businesses. It's really important to keep engaged. 15 years ago, it was 30 jurisdictions max. Now, in order to learn from one another, because the US and the European enforcement is quite experienced. The number of cases now, you have new exciting cases on the that every jurisdiction on this planet feel that they have to do things that will, in particular for smaller companies, we just for us to review what one would sort of as a slang giant is buying a smaller company in order to make sure there is a risk that we will not look at them, neither will a national. Really key, because no jurisdiction here is big enough.
Just one thing to that. I think the example here is right in front of us, that director. Because, for instance, we're not even collecting anymore at the Federal Trade Commission consolidation data per industry. Vestager talked about. The other thing I'd add is trade agreements. As allies that we are looking at USMCA, the Mexican-Canadian trade agreement in the U.S. on pharmaceuticals that of exclusionary conduct and competition. I think that's something. And maybe we'll talk about the news issues, which just happened in Australia with leaders in this area, including internationally, about that situation where threatening to leave the country. The fact that I think big now, they can literally threaten to leave an entire nation.
On this point, if I could ask you, and if I can also ask our audience, if I can ask you a bit more on the US role in this. And in Europe, there is for sure a very big debate about digital taxation, which I'm sure from a sharing the taxation burden, the pie of the tax revenues, government across the Atlantic when it comes to dealing with these big tech companies?
Well, again, we are proud of our tech sector in the US. They have brought incredible new products on the market, and we want to continue. One of this issue of taxation and data pricing is something that we're looking at here. Our business model is to use the basically profit centers, but they're not profiting themselves. As people you can send advertisements to, and every single there's privacy implications of that, but there's also monetary side, international taxation, which is always an issue with corporations, no matter if they're taxed or not, and how they're taxed. About the fact, and I personally believe there should be more of some kind of a data tax that accrues to the benefit. Basically, these companies are using to make a profit off of. So we're having major discussions here about that as well. So I tax these companies appropriately when they are benefiting off the backs of the people in a search.
I imagine that when we have our COVID t-shirts that say you're on mute, since that is the most uttered phrase.
I've noticed that the first graders have learned how to use the mute button sometimes better than some
we all enjoy the inadvertent unmuted politician, however, so please don't stop doing that. You've made the point that there are lots of issues involved in competition, labor share and stuff in the past about this has implications for how monetary and fiscal policy work. And I wonder if you could talk about, that's not obvious, I think, always.
It is very important to recognize that when a company is really is a good thing at the time of shock, because it might be also it gives this company an opportunity not necessarily correlated to what the example. monetary policy. We now have accommodative monetary policy for a reason. What we want is companies at the time when the pandemic has restricted the functioning of the economy. You can just ignore that signal from policy and do much more if you decide to, and then doing much more, especially in comparative terms for others, to this policy signal. And that, of course, weakens itself. So why? Because we want policies about monetary as impactful as possible. And the taxpayer, who ultimately is the one footing this. So that is the reason why. It's a very simple point that in companies having an opportunity here remains hugely as effective as possible. And since I kind of cite, you cannot stop the fact that more people are buying things online rather than in the. Don't want to stop structural change. We just want to be sure that companies do not use more than consumers and society as a whole.
I'd love to ask you, Stager, but perhaps also to the senator. I'm sure both will be interested in the. And he's wondering about the Chinese big tech companies, and in particular Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, so the BATX, and to what extent those companies pose actually a competition policy problem in Europe, in the US, in the world, and how should our authorities in both sides of the Atlantic deal with those companies?
Well, I'll answer briefly, and I'd love to hear what Margarita has to say about it. But competition policy is in China. In fact, a lot of what their competition policy, antitrust policy has been, is to their competitors and bolster up their own. That's the first problem. With stealing intellectual property, with basically not being good players. To add to all of that, some of the recent hacking and the serious concerns in the US about using some of these. Reason you have that with the anti-competitive their economy. And to me, the answer is joining with our, we have been talking about for years, to take on these terms or trade negotiations. And I'd love to hear what has to say.
It's something that we truly watch. Footprints in Europe. And one of the things that we see is I had a high-level digital dialogue with Vice President Ri earlier. One of the sort of tangible outcomes, number of things, to say we need to work on this, because we see a lot of standards, and this is reflected any trading platform to know their business customer, so that there is someone to be held responsible if a product that lives up to European standards when it comes to safety. So thing, and where sort of the problem also will, but also in the legislation to be passed. And obviously in Europe, well, you will have to live by the and vice versa. A European agreement with China, which puts us sort of comes to agreements with China, that ought to give Europe. But of course, it still remains to be seen. But the reciprocity that we would want to open, obviously, than China, which is why we have reasons why we later this year will table a foreign state subsidies to make sure that square and that you pick up your own operating costs if you're successful or not.
Senator, I wonder, it seems at the moment tech companies have come forward with a lot of criticism. Facebook and Google and Amazon.
Really?
And in now the heroes of the pandemic. So I wonder how you see the retail politics of this at the moment in the US.
We need technology. We know that, and we certainly are great. Someone who tends to be a little more moderate in tone. I've called people best for the people of our country, and what's best to bring prices down and bring in more innovation and new ideas. Competition policy, and believe in it in your heart and not hate these companies. Let me use the government got involved, and this is under both Democratic and Republican, in taking on the breakup of AT&T. It was a big deal. What came out of it? Lower long distance cellular phone market, which at its beginnings was nothing but these huge phones that AT&T that came out of it. Their own former director said they were stronger because they had gone through the process. Products, yes, but do they believe, and the polls have shown this over and over again, that markets should be just small town in Albert Lea, Minnesota, and a woman looked at me. She said, "I saw you on TV. I agreed with what you said, and I just." She said, "No, it was about big. It was about big in agriculture, and that's true. It costs us too." Get this, and they get that we are a country of entrepreneurs. Americans are fiercely because people were fleeing the monopolies of England, whether it came along later or all of the came for freedom of politics and freedom of speech, to be entrepreneurs. And so that is deep ingrained on through the centuries, when farmers stood with pitchforks to monopolies in ag and transportation and rail. Chicago, because of robber barons and the like, and literally back to some kind over monopolies. And so I think that we are against us. I know that. I see it every single day. It's really easy to say, why is air rates so high out of mid-sized city? Why are seeds so high? Why is it that you can't get choices when it comes to privacy on what's going on? And it's up to us as leaders to captivate them. I've been doing every single day to get bills introduced and passed on newspaper negotiations us to take this on. And I'd start by not calling it antitrust word for people to get their arms around. I think competition policy.
Guntram?
Yes, so I wanted to ask a question to Kristalina about the question of industrial policy and how we see the tension between competition policy on the one hand and industrial policy on the other hand. And industrial policy, in a sense, has seen a huge revival already prior to the pandemic. But during the pandemic, it's been really all about supporting our companies, supporting them to survive, create the new vaccine more quickly. So where do you see the tensions, and where should we fall in this? Grete, you also want to say something about that, I'm sure, but first perhaps Kristalina.
But what we are witnessing is huge drivers of structural transformation, the need to deal with the digital economy was expanding before the pandemic. The pandemic, and we support this transformation with smart policy and can compete policy. And what we do at the fund is to provide evidence there can be a policy action that accelerates transformation and shared. Take, for example, the transition to the new climate economy. Price signals, and in many places that has been done with putting a price on carbon. When we put it in the infrastructure that underpins green mobility, that is also not productive. And the benefits of it more broadly shared, and then think of competition policy toolbox that helps of entrepreneurship, innovation, the animal spirits of entrepreneurs
Seems like a good time for me to sign off now that we're talking about my vaccine event, but I just wanted to thank everyone and forward to seeing them in person.
Thank you very much for making time for us, Senator. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. It was great seeing you. When I have the floor, because as you said, Guntram, I would indeed like to. It was sort of old school state interventionism. Small group of politicians selecting what and competition law enforcement and competition policy is basically together very well. Because we can correct market failure where risk is a barrier for innovation to happen, which is why European interest in batteries in order to push for next use and recycle batteries, which is not a thing that any individual business would do. It would keep the market open. It would keep it dynamic. It would support, for instance, of suppliers to develop rather than say. So a modern industrial policy really needs competition with possible businesses. So in that, I really, because I think that is the approach. And if we stronger businesses, and we will indeed also have stronger businesses who will entrepreneurs in the specific to fight climate change and to make the best possible use of digital technology. We want to go, as you have seen it in the industrial policy that we launched.
Thank you. Managing Director, what would you most like to see what is it that you think should be done differently than it's done today?
Well, let me say that Senator Klobuchar and from Margrethe quite a lot of done, especially in this very fast-changing area. What we observe at the fund, and this is also in our new, in this time of rapid change, competition authorities do each and every angle of especially merger and acquisitions. Comprehension to aspects that, for example, not necessarily to be guided just by size, but to be guided by a merger and acquisition as they do their research. They have to, even if there is no immediate evidence of wrongdoing, just so on their toes. It is important to think about interim measures. Maybe we do not have any more the luxury to finish agility in between. And if I were to say one thing that that I am particularly keen to see, it is a special unit that is actually dedicated to the competition in the digital area to understand the conclusion that Senator Klobuchar already brought up. They have to be impressed by this. Over the last decades, the share authorities' work as percentage of GDP shrunk by the market power has gone up, but the capacity of this is not a healthy trend. And I would finish with where we were before, international collaboration. Having that collaboration, especially when decisions are taken affecting companies, so very important.
Yes, we really only have, I think, 1 or 2 more minutes left before on an aspect also asked by someone here on Slido about sustainability included or not in competition policy assessments. Perhaps more ambitious sustainability criteria on the EU side than on the US side. Any thoughts on this? Quick thoughts?
Yes, indeed, because we have launched in September. We had a conference in February exactly to address this. Competition in itself is a really important competitive auctions for the subsidies for renewable have brought down the prices. Most obviously in our state aid guidelines for environment and energy aid, but I just want to add one thing to what Kristalina said, and this is that history is not over. We need also to enable strong negotiating position to get part of the value that is being created. Right now, what is called sort of self-employed on platforms actually towards their de facto employer. And I think that's really important that we don't forget power rights, because that is also part of fighting excessive concentration, and that profits are that we enable people to organize so they have a strong. In that respect, we still have a lot to do, and I think that is and that is also an issue, and I think we share that competition law enforcement should do its vigilant to get a stronger negotiating position.
Well, with that, thank you very much. Also to Senator Klobuchar. I think this is a conversation that will continue when the pandemic. International Monetary Fund is doing, and that people at the European Commission and the US Senate are taking advantage of, will help us, I hope, to have a more proper. With that, we're going to turn to a panel of I'm very pleased that my former colleague from the Wall Street Journal, Greg Ip, who is at the International Monetary Fund, is one of the primary authors of the report. Nancy Rose, technology in Boston, and Tommaso Valletti,